June 1945, Camp Swift, Texas. Hauptmann Werner Richter, a decorated panzer commander who had never surrendered to anyone, stared at a piece of meat on his plate and did something he hadn't done since Stalingrad. He cried. This wasn't supposed to happen. 2 months earlier, Nazi propaganda had promised these men that Americans would starve them, torture them, work them to death. Instead, on their first night in Texas, they were served a meal better than what Hitler ate in his bunker. But this isn't just a story about food. It's about what happened when proud German soldiers discovered the truth about American power and how a Texas rancher's simple act of respect changed one man's entire worldview. The sun hung low over the Texas plains that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that Werner had never seen in Germany. The heat pressed down like an iron hand, different from the cold that had killed so many of his men in Russia. This heat was alive, thick with the smell of dry grass and something else he couldn't name. Something that smelled like freedom, though he wouldn't have admitted it then. Werner was 32 years old, though he looked 50. 6 years of war had carved deep lines into his face lines that mapped every battle from Paris to the frozen hell of Stalingrad. He was tall, 6 feet even, with shoulders broadened by years of hauling tank treads and ammunition. His hair, once golden, had faded to the color of winter wheat. A scar ran down his right cheek, a souvenir from Russian shrapnel at Kursk. His left hand was missing its smallest finger, crushed beyond repair, when his panzer took a direct hit. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Blue as Baltic ice, they had seen too much. They had seen his younger brother Karl die in the snow at Stalingrad, blood freezing before it could pool. They had seen Paris burn. They had seen the Atlantic Wall crumble on D-Day. They had seen the Third Reich collapse like a house built on sand. Werner came from Hamburg, from a family of engineers and builders. His father, Erich, had designed ships, beautiful merchant vessels, that sailed the world before the war turned them into targets. His father died in the firebombing of Hamburg in 1943, buried under the rubble of the city he helped build. His mother had passed when Werner was just 10, leaving behind only photographs and the smell of her perfume that lingered in old clothes. Before the war, Werner had been a mechanical engineer at BMW, designing engines that purred like cats. He had married Ingrid in 1938, a summer wedding full of hope and white dresses in Champagne. Their daughter Anna was born in 1938, a blonde angel with her mother's smile. Werner carried their photograph in his breast pocket, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from rain and blood and the general destruction of everything he'd once known. He hadn't joined the Nazi Party. He'd served because that's what German men did when their country called. He'd commanded a Panzer IV through 3 years of hell, not because he believed in the Führer's mad dreams, but because his crew depended on him, because his brother served, because retreat meant death. The memory of his last Christmas at home came to him unbidden as the truck carrying him and 29 other prisoners rolled through the Camp Swift gates, Hamburg, December 1938. His father carving a roast pork, the last good meat they'd see for years, though they didn't know it then. Eat up, Werner, his father had said, his engineer's hands steady with the knife. Next year there will be war, and we won't have meals like this anymore. Werner had laughed. Father, you worry too much. Germany is strong. Erich Richter had looked at his son with eyes that had survived one world war already. Germany lost the last war because we couldn't feed our soldiers. A starving army always loses no matter how brave. Werner hadn't believed him. Not then. 6 years and a million deaths later, he remembered those words as his empty stomach cramped with hunger. His tank hadn't been destroyed by superior Allied tactics. It had run out of fuel 40 kilometers from the front. His men hadn't died from lack of courage. They died because they were too weak from hunger to march fast enough when the Americans broke through at Normandy. His father had been right. Germany had lost because while their soldiers starved, their enemies ate. The capture came on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. Werner's unit, what remained of it, 47 men from an original 200, had been surrounded near Regensburg. They'd had no food for 3 days except one raw potato per man. No ammunition, no fuel, no hope. The American lieutenant who accepted Werner's surrender had handed him a chocolate bar. Werner had stared at it, this small brown rectangle wrapped in paper, unable to comprehend such casual abundance. The American had smiled not unkindly and said, "War's over, Captain. You can stop being hungry now." The journey to America took 3 weeks. First by truck to Bremerhaven, then 18 days on a converted cargo ship across the Atlantic packed in with 500 other prisoners. The food on the ship was basic black bread, thin soup water. Enough to survive, nothing more. Werner had expected worse. Geneva Convention protections meant little when the victors were angry and the defeated were at their mercy. But as the train carried them from New York to Texas, Werner began to see things that didn't match the propaganda he'd been fed. Through the windows of the prisoner car, he watched America roll past, fields of corn stretching to the horizon, towns with white churches and paved streets, factories with smokestacks that hadn't been bombed into rubble, women in bright dresses, children playing baseball in green parks. Mein Gott, whispered Hans Weber, a Luftwaffe pilot in the bunk below Werner's. Look at all that farmland. It goes on forever. It did. Mile after mile of rich black soil growing food enough to feed millions. Germany had fought for Lebensraum living space, believing they needed to conquer the East to survive. But here was America, a country that already had more space than it knew what to do with. More food, more everything. Otto Klein, a grizzled Feldwebel who'd served since Poland, spat on the floor. They could lose half their country and still have more than all of Europe combined. It was true, and the truth sat heavy in Werner's chest like undigested bread. Camp Swift appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent. Werner had expected something from the propaganda films: guard towers with machine guns, barbed wire, dogs straining at leashes held by brutal guards. What he saw instead looked more like a small college campus that had been dropped into the Texas prairie. The truck rumbled through gates that stood open, manned by 2 American soldiers who were leaning against the fence posts, chewing gum, and talking lazily in the thick accent of Texas. They carried M1 rifles, but the weapons hung loose on their shoulders, not pointed at anything in particular. One of them waved as the truck passed, actually waved like they were greeting neighbors, not enemy prisoners. The camp itself spread across several acres of flat Texas grassland. 15 wooden barracks painted white with red roofs lined up in neat rows. There was a small chapel with a cross on top, a medical building marked with a red cross, a recreation hall larger than the others. Between the buildings, actual grass grew cut short and neat. In the distance, Werner could see prisoners, German prisoners, playing volleyball in a court with a net that hadn't been made from barbed wire. "This is a trick," muttered Friedrich Schmidt, an Oberleutnant who'd been a true believer in National Socialism. "They want us to lower our guard before the interrogations begin." But Werner, trained to observe terrain and assess tactical situations, saw no evidence of deception. What he saw was order, cleanliness, and a strange kind of normalcy that made his soldiers' instincts prickle with unease. Enemy camps weren't supposed to look like this. The truck stopped in front of the administrative building. The prisoners climbed out stiffly, muscles cramped from days of travel, blinking in the bright Texas sun that was nothing like the watery northern light of Germany. A man stepped out to meet them, and Werner knew immediately this was someone to respect. He was tall, maybe 6'3", with shoulders like an oak beam and skin tanned dark from years under the sun. He wore the uniform of a U.S. Army sergeant, but he moved like a cowboy, all loose-limbed grace and casual confidence. A Stetson hat sat on his head at an angle that suggested he'd been wearing such hats since before the Army issued him a helmet. His face was weathered, maybe 45 years old, with lines around his eyes from squinting at distant horizons. His boots were worn, leather polished but practical. "Willkommen, Soldaten," the man said in German, so heavily accented with Texas drawl that it took Werner a moment to recognize his own language. "War's over. You're safe here." The sergeant's name was Jack Morrison, though everyone called him Tex. Werner would learn his story later, a cowboy who'd fought in the trenches of World War I at Verdun, who'd come home to raise cattle and horses, who'd lost his only son on a beach in Normandy. The same beaches where Werner had commanded a panzer firing on American landing craft. But Tex didn't look at these German prisoners with hatred. He looked at them with the tired understanding of a man who'd seen one war too many and knew that the soldiers who fought them were rarely the ones who started them. "Yeah, I know," Tex continued in English, seeing the confusion on their faces. "My German's terrible, but you'll learn English soon enough. Most of the boys here pick it up in a month or two." He gestured toward the barracks. "You officers get barrack 12. 4 men to a room, your own bunks. There's running water in each building, showers at the end of the hall. Dinner's at 6. Formations at 0700 for work assignments, but that's tomorrow's problem. Werner understood maybe half of the English, but the tone was clear enough. This wasn't the voice of a man preparing to torture prisoners. This was the voice of someone giving directions to guests who'd overstayed their welcome, but would be treated with basic courtesy anyway. They were led to Barrack 12, their boots echoing on wooden steps that didn't creak with rot. Inside the building smelled of fresh paint and pine tar and something clean Werner couldn't immediately identify. Soap. It smelled like soap. The room assigned to Werner held 4 bunks, metal frames with actual mattresses, not straw pallets. Each bunk had a pillow, a blanket that looked new, and a footlocker for personal belongings, assuming any of them had personal belongings beyond the clothes on their backs. But what stopped Werner in his tracks, what made Hans Weber actually gasp out loud, was the sink. It sat in the corner of the room, white porcelain gleaming in the afternoon light, streaming through clean windows. Above it, a mirror slightly cracked but functional. Werner approached it slowly like it might be a mirage that would disappear if he moved too fast. He turned the tap. Water flowed cold and clear and endless. Not a trickle, not a carefully rationed cup. A stream of water that ran and showed no sign of stopping. Werner cupped his hands under the flow, brought the water to his face, and for the first time in 2 weeks washed away the grime of travel. The water was so cold it hurt his teeth so clean, it tasted like nothing at all. In Germany, his wife Ingrid stood in line for hours with her ration cards to fill a single bucket. Here, water poured from a wall, as if the supply were infinite. He looked at himself in the mirror. The face that stared back was a stranger's, hollow-cheeked, stubbled with 2 weeks of beard eyes sunken deep. He'd lost maybe 30 pounds since Normandy. His uniform, once tailored to fit, now hung on him like a scarecrow's clothes. Behind him, his roommates were discovering their own small miracles. Hans touched the mattress with reverent fingers, pressing down to feel the give of actual padding. Otto opened the footlocker and found it empty, but clean, ready for possessions they didn't have. Friedrich stood by the window staring out at the volleyball game with narrowed, suspicious eyes. "Don't trust it," Friedrich said, his voice hard. "This is propaganda. They clean us up, feed us once, and then the interrogations begin. They want us soft before they start asking questions." Otto, practical, after 20 years of military service, shook his head. Or maybe they just follow the Geneva Convention. America signed it. They have to treat us according to the rules. Rules, Friedrich spat. The Americans bombed Dresden, killed 100,000 civilians. You think they care about rules? Werner said nothing. He was thinking about his father's words, about logistics, about the fact that a country with unlimited running water in every building could afford to treat prisoners well because it cost them almost nothing to do so. A country this rich didn't need to torture prisoners for information. They could just wait. Starving men talked. Well-fed men still talked, but slower. The bell rang at 6 o'clock, exactly the sound echoing across the camp. Tex's voice boomed from outside. "Dinner time, gentlemen." The word gentlemen struck Werner as absurd. They were prisoners, defeated enemies, men who'd killed American soldiers. But Tex said it like he meant it. The walk to the dining hall took 2 minutes. Werner's stomach, which had learned to stop complaining about hunger months ago, suddenly woke up and started cramping with anticipation. The smell hit them 50 yards away, meat cooking, real meat, not the ersatz protein made from sawdust, and hope that German soldiers had survived on for the last 2 years. The dining hall was enormous, easily 300 square meters with 15 long wooden tables that could seat 20 men each. At one end, a serving line had been set up, steam rising from metal containers. Behind the line stood several men in cook's whites, and at the center, like a king in his castle, stood the largest man Werner had ever seen outside of a circus. Chuck Williams was his name, and he looked like someone had taken a grizzly bear and taught it to cook. 6'4", 300 pounds, most of it around his middle, with arms like hams and a beard going silver. He wore a stained apron over his army uniform and a smile that suggested he genuinely enjoyed feeding people. "Line up, boys!" Chuck's voice was pure Texas thunder rolling across the room. "Texas-style dinner tonight." Werner grabbed a metal tray from the stack, still warm from washing, and joined the line. His hands were shaking slightly, and he hated himself for it. Officers didn't shake. Panzer commanders who'd held the line at Kursk didn't tremble over a meal. But he did. The first server plopped a massive scoop of mashed potatoes onto his tray, white and fluffy and topped with a pat of butter that began melting immediately. Werner stared at the butter. Real butter. Yellow and glistening. More butter in that single pat than his family had seen in a month. "You want more butter?" the server asked in English, mistaking Werner's stare for a request. Before Werner could respond, another pat landed on top of the first. The next station held beans, pinto beans, cooked with chunks of bacon, the fat glistening. Then corn on the cob, brushed with more butter. Then two thick slices of white bread, soft and fresh. And then Werner reached Chuck Williams. Chuck stood before a massive grill, flames licking up around thick cuts of meat. He used long tongs to lift one from the heat, and Werner's breath stopped in his throat. A T-bone steak. 18 ounces, if it was an ounce 2 inches thick with a perfect char on the outside, and pink juice running from where Chuck's tongs pressed into it. The smell was intoxicating: beef fat smoke, black pepper, something primal that spoke to the hindbrain about survival and plenty and life itself. Chuck laid it on Werner's plate with a sound like a judge's gavel thump. Werner couldn't move. He stood there blocking the line, staring at the piece of meat that weighed more than some of the daily rations his entire tank crew had shared. The marbling of fat ran through it in white veins. Steam rose from it. It was real. It was actually impossibly real. "First time seeing real beef, son?" Chuck asked, not unkindly. Werner nodded. He couldn't speak. His throat had closed up with something that felt dangerously close to tears. Chuck's expression softened. "Welcome to Texas." He nodded toward the end of the line. "Get yourself some milk, fresh from this morning." Werner moved on autopilot. At the end of the line, someone handed him a glass of cold milk, condensation already forming on the outside. He carried his tray to a table and sat down mechanically, his mind unable to process what his eyes were seeing. Around him, other German prisoners were having similar reactions. Hans Weber held his fork over his steak like a man afraid to wake up from a dream. Otto Klein had already cut a piece and was chewing slowly, eyes closed, a look of something like pain on his face. Friedrich Schmidt stared at his plate with an expression that mixed desire with betrayal, as if the food were a personal insult to his ideology. Werner picked up his knife and fork, American utensils heavier than German ones, solid in his hands. He cut a small piece of steak, the knife sliding through with almost no resistance. Medium rare, the inside a perfect pink. He lifted it to his mouth. The taste when it hit his tongue was beyond anything he'd imagined. The richness of the beef grain, fed and properly aged. The char from the grill, adding a smoky depth. The salt and pepper and the burnt clean flavor of quality meat cooked by someone who knew what they were doing. It was warm. It was tender. It melted against his palate and slid down his throat and hit his stomach with the weight of revelation. Werner had last eaten beef 3 years ago. He'd last eaten anything resembling a proper meal 6 months ago. For the past 2 weeks, he'd survived on black bread and thin soup. For 6 years before that, German rations had been slowly, steadily decreasing as the war machine consumed everything the country could produce. And here in an enemy prison camp, he was eating better than he'd eaten at his own wedding feast. The tears came before he could stop them. They ran down his cheeks into his beard, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. Around him, other men were crying too. Hans Weber had his head down, shoulders shaking. Even Otto Klein, who'd survived 20 years of military service with stoic practicality, had moisture in his eyes. This wasn't crying from sadness. This was something else. This was the physical manifestation of understanding. Of the moment when propaganda met reality and shattered like glass. If America could give its prisoners food like this, what did they give their own soldiers? If this was how they treated defeated enemies, what was the scale of their abundance? Germany had fought for 6 years, had mobilized every resource, had stripped its people down to starvation rations, and still lost. And America had been holding back, had been operating at a fraction of its capacity, and still crushed the Third Reich like an afterthought. Werner chewed slowly, trying to make each bite last, trying to memorize the taste, because part of him still believed this couldn't be real. This had to be a special meal, a one-time propaganda effort to soften them up. Tomorrow would bring the real prison food, gruel and moldy bread and the slow starvation he'd been prepared for. Tex Morrison walked past their table, stopped, looked at Werner's tears. The big cowboy didn't say anything. He just nodded once, a gesture of respect between soldiers, between men who'd both seen too much and understood too much. Then he moved on, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Werner finished his steak, then his potatoes, then his beans and corn and bread. He drank the milk cold and sweet and creamy. He used his bread to wipe up every drop of juice and butter left on his plate, because wasting food was a sin his mother had beaten into him, and 6 years of war had reinforced. His stomach, shrunken from months of near starvation, cramped with the sudden abundance. He felt sick and satisfied and confused and grateful and angry all at once. The meal sat in his belly like a stone, heavy with implications he wasn't ready to examine. Back in Barrack 12, as the Texas sun finally set and darkness fell over the camp, the arguments began. Friedrich paced the small room like a caged animal. They bought you. All of you. One meal and you're ready to forget who you are, what you fought for. We fought for Germany, Otto said quietly from his bunk. Germany lost. That's reality, Friedrich. Accept it. I'll never accept it. We were betrayed by weak leaders, by Jews in the government, by the cowards who surrendered when we should have fought to the last man. Werner, who'd been sitting silently by the window, finally spoke. We should have fought to the last man on what fuel, Friedrich? With what ammunition, while eating what food? Friedrich turned on him. So you're saying we deserve to lose? I'm saying we lost because America had more of everything, more steel, more oil, more men, more food. Werner's voice was flat, emotionless. The voice he'd used to give tactical reports when his tank crew was dying around him. I'm saying my father was right. A starving army loses no matter how brave it is. Your father was a defeatist. Werner stood up and suddenly the room felt very small. He was taller than Friedrich, broader, with a hardness earned from 6 years of combat versus Friedrich's 2 years of staff positions. My father was an engineer who understood logistics. He died under British bombs in Hamburg. Don't speak of him again. The tension held for a long moment, then Friedrich turned away, muttering about reporting this conversation to the senior German officers in camp. Let him, Werner thought. The war was over. The Reich was ashes. Ideology didn't fill empty stomachs. After Friedrich left, slamming the door, Hans Weber spoke softly from his bunk. What do you really think, Hauptmann, about all this? Werner returned to the window, looked out at the camp. Lights burned in the other barracks. Somewhere someone was playing a harmonica, a mournful German folk song. The Texas night was full of sounds, crickets, a distant coyote, the murmur of men's voices. I think, Werner said slowly, that we never had a chance. I think the war was lost before it started because we didn't understand what we were fighting. We thought it was about courage and willpower and superior tactics, but it wasn't. It was about factories and farms and oil fields. It was about who could feed their soldiers and who couldn't. And we couldn't. He thought about the steak still sitting heavy in his belly. They're not feeding us like this to be kind. They're feeding us because it costs them almost nothing. Because they have so much excess capacity that giving prime beef to prisoners is just normal for them. That's the scale we're talking about. That's why we lost. Otto grunted agreement. Hans was quiet for a long time, then asked, what happens to us now? I don't know, Werner admitted, but I intend to find out. For sleep, Werner took out the materials he'd been issued: paper, a pencil, an envelope. Prisoners were allowed to write home letters to be screened by censors, but generally sent along. He sat at the small desk by the window and began to write to Ingrid. The words came slowly, carefully. How to explain what he'd seen. How to describe the impossible. Plenty of it all. He wrote about the camp, about the food, about the water that never stopped running. He didn't write about his tears, but he did write, I'm beginning to understand why we lost. Not because we were weak, but because they were so much stronger than anyone told us. He sealed the letter, addressed it to Hamburg, assuming the city still existed, assuming Ingrid and Anna were still alive. He had no way of knowing. Mail from Germany was sporadic at best. The Red Cross tried, but Europe was chaos. He could only write and hope and wait. Werner lay down on his bunk on the mattress that was softer than any bed he'd slept in since 1940. His stomach was full for the first time in years. He was clean. He was safe. He was a prisoner, but he was alive. Sleep should have come easily, but it didn't, because Werner Richter Hauptmann, of the Wehrmacht, veteran of 6 years of war, was thinking about tomorrow. Tex had mentioned work assignments. Volunteers who wanted to work outside the camp, help local farmers who were short on labor because their sons were off fighting in Japan or had died in Europe. Werner wanted to see more, wanted to understand the full scope of what he was up against, what Germany had been up against. The stake was one data point. The running water was another. But what about the rest? What about the world beyond this camp? What did the heart of American power actually look like as he lay in the darkness listening to Hans's soft snoring and Otto's occasional cough? Werner made a decision. Tomorrow when they asked for volunteers, he would raise his hand. He would go outside the wire and see for himself what kind of country could lose 500,000 men and still have enough left over to feed its enemy's stake. The last thought that crossed his mind before sleep finally claimed him was this: if they can give prisoners food like that, what are they giving their own people? And somewhere in the darkness, like an echo of his father's voice, came the answer: everything. They're giving them everything. Morning came to Camp Swift with the sound of a bugle call that echoed across the Texas plains, sharp and clear in the cool air before dawn. Werner woke instantly, a reflex trained into him by years of military service. For a moment, disoriented in the darkness, he thought he was back in his panzer waiting for the order to advance. Then he felt the softness of the mattress beneath him and remembered. Texas, prison camp, the stake. His stomach no longer hurt. The cramping from last night's abundance had passed, leaving behind only a pleasant fullness he'd almost forgotten was possible. He sat up, placed his feet on the wooden floor that was smooth and clean, and for the first time in 6 years, didn't immediately feel the gnawing hunger that had become his constant companion. The other men in his room were stirring. Hans rolled over and groaned softly. Otto was already up, standing by the sink, splashing water on his face with the casual waste of someone still getting used to the idea that water was unlimited. Friedrich's bunk was empty. He'd apparently risen even earlier, probably to find the other true believers and complain about how they were all being corrupted by American plenty. At 7 o'clock, the prisoners assembled in the central yard. The morning sun was just cresting the horizon, turning the sky the color of brass. The air smelled different here than in Germany. Drier. Hotter already even this early. Werner could smell sage and dust and something sweet he couldn't identify. Mesquite, he'd learn later, burning in someone's breakfast fire miles away. Tex Morrison stood on a small platform, his Stetson hat silhouetted against the rising sun. Behind him stood several other American soldiers and a handful of civilians. Ranchers and farmers, Werner guessed from their weathered faces and work clothes. Men who'd spent their lives under this brutal Texas sun doing hard labor. "Morning, gentlemen," Tex called out in his drawling English. A German interpreter translated, though many of the prisoners were starting to pick up basic English from the guards. "Some of you have been here a few weeks already and know the drill. For you new arrivals, here's how it works. We've got local ranchers and farmers who need hands. Their boys are overseas or never coming back, and they've got work that needs doing. You volunteer, you work 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. You get paid 80 cents a day in camp scrip. You can spend it at the canteen on candy, cigarettes, toiletries, or save it to send money home through the Red Cross when postal service gets more regular. 80 cents a day. Werner did the quick math, almost $5 a week, $20 a month. Converted to Reichsmarks, if the Reichsmark still had any value, that would be enough to feed a family for a month. Maybe more, given that German currency was effectively worthless now. "Work is voluntary," Tex continued. "Nobody's forced. But the men who work say it beats sitting around camp getting bored. You'll be supervised, but you won't be chained up or mistreated. You'll get lunch on the bar, same quality as you get here. And you'll get to see a bit of Texas. Any questions?" Several hands went up. Someone asked about escape. Tex's face hardened slightly. "Don't. You're in the middle of Texas. Nearest city is 30 miles away. You'd die of heat stroke before you made it halfway. We've had 3 men try in the last 6 months. 2 got brought back by local farmers. 1 died. We buried him with full military honors. Don't be stupid." The message was clear. The leniency they were being shown had limits. Volunteers stepped forward. Werner stepped forward without hesitation. Behind him he heard Hans follow, then Otto. Friedrich stayed where he was, arms crossed, glaring at those who'd volunteered as if they were traitors. Tex looked over the group, maybe 40 men out of the 200 prisoners in camp. He nodded, satisfied. "Good. We'll split you into groups. Ranch work, farm work, some construction, based on your skills and what needs doing. A civilian stepping forward and Werner got his first close look at a real Texas rancher. The man was probably 60, maybe older, with skin like leather and eyes the color of faded denim. He was tall, lean as a fence post, with shoulders that had once been broad, but were now bent slightly from decades of hard labor. He wore blue jeans, a faded work shirt, scuffed boots, and a hat that had seen better days 20 years ago. His hands, when he removed his hat, were enormous, scarred, and calloused, the hands of a man who'd worked with them every day of his life. "Name's Joe Harper," the man said in English, thick with Texas. The interpreter translated. "I run a cattle ranch about 15 miles from here. 3,000 acres, used to run it with my 3 boys. Now I run it with my youngest and whatever help I can get. I need 6 men who know something about animals and aren't afraid of hard work." Werner raised his hand. "I worked with horses before the war and mechanical equipment." Joe looked at him, really looked, taking in Werner's height, his build, the way he stood at attention even in prisoner's clothes. "You understand English?" "Some," Werner said carefully in English. "I learned quick." Joe's weathered face cracked into something that might have been a smile. "Fair enough, you're hired." He pointed at 5 other men, including Hans and Otto. "You two, be ready to go in 10 minutes. Bring a hat if you got one. Texas sun'll cook your brain if you're not careful." The truck that carried them to the Harper Ranch was older than the war of Ford from the 1930s, with wooden slat sides and tires that were nearly bald. Joe drove with the casual confidence of a man who'd been driving these roads since before they were paved. Werner sat in the back with the other prisoners watching Texas roll past. The landscape was nothing like Germany. Flat where Germany was hilly, dry where Germany was green. The sky here was impossibly big, arching overhead in a dome of blue so intense it almost hurt to look at. The land stretched away in all directions, broken only by occasional clusters of mesquite trees and the straight lines of fence posts marching toward the horizon. "How much land did he say?" Hans asked in German. 3,000 acres, Werner replied. He'd been doing the conversion in his head. 12 square kilometers. That's bigger than some German villages. Otto whistled low. "And that's just one ranch. How much land does this country have?" The answer Werner was starting to understand was more than they could imagine. Germany had fought for Lebensraum, living space, believing they needed to conquer Russia to have enough room to survive. But America already had more space than it knew what to do with. The war in Europe had been fought over territories smaller than a single Texas county. The Harper Ranch appeared on the horizon as a collection of buildings that grew larger as they approached. A main house, white painted wood with a wraparound porch. A massive barn, red paint fading but structure solid. Several smaller outbuildings. Corrals holding horses and cattle. A windmill turning slowly in the hot breeze, pumping water from deep underground. Water. Always water. Werner was beginning to understand that water was the foundation of everything here. You couldn't ranch 3,000 acres without water, and the Harpers had apparently tapped into an aquifer that seemed as limitless as the sky above. Joe parked the truck and climbed out, moving with the stiffness of a man whose back hurt every morning, but who'd long since stopped complaining about it. "Come on then, let me show you around." The barn was the largest structure Werner had seen outside of a factory. Inside it was cool and dark and smelled of hay and leather and animals. Dozens of stalls lined both walls. Tools hung on pegs, organized and well-maintained. A tack room held saddles and bridles that looked old but cared for. Everything spoke of order, of systems developed over decades, of a family that knew their business. "My granddaddy built this barn in 1885, Joe said, running a hand along one of the massive support beams. "Live oak. It'll stand another 100 years if we take care of it." He turned to look at the prisoners. "That's what I need help with. Taking care of things. Feeding stock. Mending fence. Basic maintenance. Nothing complicated, but it needs doing every day. You do good work, you'll eat lunch with us. My wife cooks for the hands. You slack off, you'll go back to camp. Fair," Werner translated, for those whose English wasn't good enough. Everyone nodded. Fair was more than fair. This was better treatment than they'd have gotten in their own army. Joe led them to the corrals where maybe 30 horses stood in the morning sun. Quarter horses, mostly compact and muscular, bred for ranch work. Werner felt something stir in his chest at the sight of them. Before the war, before the Panzers, he'd loved horses. His uncle had owned a small farm outside Hamburg. Werner had spent summers there as a boy learning to ride, learning to care for animals. You said you know horses, Joe said to Werner. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, sir. My uncle had horses. I rode before I could walk nearly. Show me. Joe opened the gate. Werner stepped into the corral, moving slowly, hands visible, making no sudden movements. The horses watched him with the cautious intelligence of prey animals who'd learned which humans to trust. He approached a bay gelding, a solid-looking animal with kind eyes. Extended his hand, let the horse smell him. Ran his fingers along the animal's neck, checking for heat or swelling, the automatic assessment of someone who knew what to look for. The horse nickered softly and leaned into his touch. Werner felt something crack open in his chest. For 6 years, he'd touched nothing but steel and guns and death. The warmth of living flesh under his hand, the simple trust of an animal, it was almost more than he could bear. He likes you, Joe observed. That's Buck. He's a good horse, but he can be particular about who handles him. The rancher studied Werner for a long moment. You really were a soldier, fought in the war. Yes, sir. Panzer commander. I fought in France, Russia, back to Germany. My oldest boy died in France, Normandy. Joe's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, but something moved behind his eyes. June 7th, 1944, day after D-Day. He was 19. The silence that followed was heavy. Werner kept his hand on the horse's neck, feeling the animal's heartbeat steady and strong. He'd commanded a panzer at Normandy. He'd fired on landing craft. He'd killed American soldiers, young men like Joe's son boys, who'd never had the chance to go home and work their father's ranch. I'm sorry, Werner said quietly and meant it. Joe nodded once. War's over now. He's gone and you're here, and that's how it is. He cleared his throat. You know how to saddle a horse? Yes, sir. Then let's get to work. The next 8 hours passed in a blur of physical labor that felt almost cleansing. Werner saddled horses, mucked stalls, hauled feed, mended fence line in the brutal Texas sun. His hands, which had grown soft during the weeks of travel and imprisonment, began to blister and then harden. His back ached. Sweat soaked through his shirt and dried and soaked through again. The sun beat down with an intensity that made the Russian winter seem like a distant dream. But it was good work, honest work. Work that built something instead of destroying it. Work that left him tired in a way that felt right, not the exhausted despair of retreat, but the satisfied exhaustion of a job done well. The other prisoners worked alongside him. Hans struggled with the horses at first, but showed a surprising aptitude for mechanical work when Joe asked him to help repair a tractor. Otto, the old soldier, took to the routine, immediately understanding that ranch work was like the army work. Show up, do what you're told, don't complain. Even the men who'd never worked with animals before began to find their rhythm. At noon, Joe's wife rang a bell from the main house. The sound carried across the ranch, sweet and clear. Lunch, Joe said. Come on. They washed at a pump outside the house, cold water that tasted faintly of minerals. Werner scrubbed his hands and face, trying to make himself presentable. He was nervous, though he wouldn't have admitted it. This would be the first time he'd eaten at a table with Americans. Real Americans, not soldiers, but civilians. The enemy's family. The house was modest inside, but clean and comfortable. The living room had a sofa covered in a faded floral pattern, photographs on the mantel, a radio in the corner. Through a doorway, Werner could see a dining room with a long table already set. Joe's wife appeared from the kitchen, and Werner understood immediately where Joe's sons had gotten there at night. She was nearly 6 feet tall, with silver hair, pulled back in a bun, and eyes that were sharp and assessing. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked over the prisoners with the same measuring gaze she probably used on cattle. Married, Joe said. These are the men from Camp Swift. They've been working hard all morning. Set them places at the table. Mary nodded. Wash your hands again with soap. There's a bathroom down the hall. Her voice was firm but not unkind. The bathroom was a revelation. Indoor plumbing, a toilet that flushed, a sink with hot and cold running water, soap that smelled like lavender, a clean towel hanging on a rack. Werner washed his hands twice, still unable to fully believe the casual luxury of it all. When he returned to the dining room, the table had been set for 8, Joe and Mary at the heads, the 6 prisoners along the sides. Mary was bringing dishes from the kitchen, and the smells made Werner's mouth water, despite his nervousness. Fried chicken, mountains of it, golden brown and glistening, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans cooked with bacon, cornbread still warm from the oven. sliced tomatoes from the garden, a pitcher of iced tea sweating in the Texas heat. Mary sat down and Joe bowed his head. The prisoners, uncertain, followed suit. Lord, Joe said simply, thank you for this food and the hands that prepared it. Thank you for these men's help today. Watch over those who can't be with us. Amen. Amen, Mary echoed. There was a moment of awkward silence, then Mary began passing dishes. Don't be shy, she said. There's plenty, and what you don't eat, the dogs will, so you might as well enjoy it. Werner took a piece of chicken, then a scoop of potatoes. The serving sizes were enormous American size, more food on his plate than a German family might see in a week. Around him, the other prisoners were similarly loading their plates with expressions that mixed hunger with disbelief. The first bite of chicken was a revelation. The skin was crispy, seasoned with salt and pepper, and something else he couldn't identify. The meat was juicy, falling off the bone. It had been fried in lard or butter, rich and indulgent. Mary had cooked this meal the way his mother used to cook before the war, when food was about pleasure instead of survival. Good, Mary asked, watching him. Very good, ma'am, Werner managed in English. Best chicken I ever eat. Something in Mary's face softened. You're German then. My grandmother was German, came over in 1870, from Bavaria. I am from Hamburg, Werner said. In the north. Hamburg. Mary's expression clouded. That's where the bombing was, wasn't it? We read about it in the papers. Yes, ma'am, my father died there, in 1943. The table went quiet. Joe and Mary exchanged a look that Werner couldn't quite read. Then Mary reached across the table and patted his hand once, a gesture so maternal it made his throat tighten. I'm sorry for your loss, she said simply, and I'm sorry you're so far from home. Werner didn't trust himself to speak, so he just nodded and returned to his chicken, chewing carefully to keep his emotions in check. The conversation around the table began to flow more naturally. Joe asked about their skills, their backgrounds. Hans admitted he'd been a machinist before the war. Otto had worked construction. The others had been farmers or laborers. Ordinary men who'd been caught up in a war none of them had started. Joe told them about the ranch, about the drought of '38 that had nearly ruined them, about the cattle market and the price of feed. He spoke to them as equals, as workers, not as enemies or prisoners. It was disorienting and oddly comforting at the same time. After the main course, Mary brought out dessert apple pie with ice cream. Werner stared at it, this impossible luxury, sugar and cream and fruit all combined into something that existed purely for pleasure. He thought about Ingrid and Anna, about the ration cards and the Lennies and the slow starvation of occupied Hamburg. And here he sat eating pie with ice cream like it was the most natural thing in the world. Ma'am, he said carefully, may I ask a question? Of course, Mom. In Germany, we have rations, very small. Sugar is rare, butter is rare, everything is rare. He gestured at the table still laden with food despite how much they'd eaten. Here you have so much. How? Joe and Mary looked at each other again. Joe answered, we're lucky, I suppose. Texas wasn't bombed. Our factories are still running. Our farms still produce. We've had rationing too, don't get me wrong. Can't get all the sugar we want, meat's been limited. But we grow a lot of our own food here on the ranch. And America's a big country, lots of farms, lots of cattle, lots of everything. We also don't have armies marching across our fields, Mary added quietly. Nobody's burned our crops or killed our livestock. We haven't had a war on our soil since 1865. That makes a difference. Werner thought about that. 80 years of peace, 80 years of building instead of destroying, 80 years of accumulating wealth and infrastructure while Europe tore itself apart repeatedly. No wonder America had won. No wonder they had so much. They'd had almost a century to prepare, even if they hadn't known they were preparing. After lunch, they returned to work. The afternoon heat was brutal, well over 90 degrees, but Joe worked alongside them, this 60-year-old man, matching their pace despite his age. Around 3 o'clock, he called a break and brought out a cooler filled with bottles of Coca-Cola ice cold and sweating in the heat. Werner had never tasted Coca-Cola. The sweet carbonation was strange but not unpleasant. Joe explained that it came from Atlanta, Georgia, thousands of miles away, shipped here in trucks that ran on gasoline that America had in abundance, while Germany's panzers had sat motionless for lack of fuel. Everything came back to that. Abundance, Sean's. Excess capacity. The ability to ship luxury items across thousands of miles while still feeding armies and building bombers and running factories. Germany had mobilized every resource and still lost. America had barely broken a sweat. At 5 o'clock, Joe called an end to the workday. "Good work," he told them. "You men earned your pay today. Same time tomorrow." They all nodded. Even the hardest skeptics among them had been won over by honest work and good treatment. As they climbed into the truck for the ride back to camp, Joe pulled Werner aside. "You're good with the horses. Real natural. If you want, I could use you specifically. Not just general labor, but working with the animals. Breaking the young ones, training them. Pays the same, but it's more skilled work." Werner looked at this old rancher who'd lost his son to a war. Werner had fought in a man who had every reason to hate Germans and yet was offering him skilled employment, trust, respect. "I would like that very much, sir," Werner said. Joe extended his hand. Werner shook it, feeling the calluses, the strength that remained in that old man's grip. It was the handshake of equals, of men who understood the value of work. On the ride back to camp, Werner was quiet, watching the sun set over the Texas plains. The sky turned orange and purple, and finally deep blue as stars began to appear brighter and more numerous than any he'd seen in Germany's bombed-out skies. Hans broke the silence. "That was the strangest day of my life." "How so?" Otto asked. "We worked for the enemy. We ate at their table. They treated us like human beings, like friends almost. How do we make sense of that?" Werner had been thinking about the same thing. "Maybe," he said slowly, "we were never really enemies. Not them and us ordinary people. Maybe the real enemy was the men who started the war, who fed us lies about who these people were." Friedrich would have called him a traitor for saying it. But Friedrich wasn't here, and Werner was beginning not to care what Friedrich thought. Back at Camp Swift after dinner, after the mandatory count, in the evening routine, Werner sat at his desk and pulled out paper to write to Ingrid. The words came easier this time. He told her about the ranch, about Joe and Mary, about their son who died at Normandy. He told her about the work, honest work with animals and land. He told her about the food, though he knew describing it would sound like fantasy to someone surviving on rations. And then he wrote something he hadn't quite admitted to himself until the words appeared on the page. "Ingrid, my love, I know this will sound strange, but I think we were lied to about everything, about what America was about, why we were fighting. I thought they were weak, decadent, soft, but they're not. They're strong in ways I'm only beginning to understand. Not strong like steel and tanks, but strong like deep roots and endless fields, and people who work hard because they believe in what they're building." He paused, uncertain how to continue. Then, "I don't know what will happen when I come home. I don't know if home still exists. But I know that everything I thought I was fighting for was built on lies. And everything I thought I was fighting against turns out to be closer to the truth than I ever imagined." He sealed the letter, knowing the censors would read it, knowing it might never reach Hamburg, knowing Ingrid might not even be alive to read it. But he had to write it anyway. Had to put into words the transformation that was happening inside him, the slow crumbling of certainties he'd built his life upon. That night, lying in his bunk with his muscles aching from good work and his belly full of good food, Werner Richter made a decision. If he survived this war, if he ever got home, he would tell people the truth about what he'd seen. Not propaganda, not lies, but the simple truth that America had won, not through brutality, but through abundance, not through cruelty, but through a kind of casual generosity that came from having more than enough. And if Germany wanted to rebuild, wanted to become strong again, it would have to learn from this, would have to understand that true strength came not from conquest, but from creation, not from taking from others, but from building for yourself. It was a lesson his father had tried to teach him over a Christmas roast in 1938. It had taken 6 years of war and a Texas rancher's handshake to finally understand. Tomorrow he would return to the ranch, would work with the horses, would eat lunch at the enemy's table and feel his understanding of the world continue to shift beneath him like sand. But tonight, for the first time since Stalingrad, Werner Richter went to sleep with something that felt dangerously close to hope. 3 months passed like water through cupped hands, each day blurring into the next in a rhythm of work and meals and slow transformation. Werner fell into the routine of the Harper Ranch, the way he'd once fallen into the rhythm of tank warfare completely, with the total focus that had kept him alive through 6 years of combat. But this was different. This routine built instead of destroyed. Every morning at 6, the truck came for him and 5 other prisoners. By July, Joe had requested Werner specifically, and the ranch work had become less about general labor and more about the horses. Werner spent his days in the corrals working with the young animals, teaching them to accept saddle and bridle, to respond to voice and heel. It was patient work, slow work, the kind of work that couldn't be rushed no matter how hard you pushed. The horses taught him something the war had tried to beat out of him. That force wasn't always the answer. A green horse couldn't be bullied into cooperation. You had to earn its trust day by day, touch by touch, until the animal chose to work with you instead of against you. Werner found himself thinking about Germany, about the Reich's philosophy of dominance through strength, and wondering if perhaps they'd had it backward all along. The Texas summer deepened into August heat that made the air shimmer like water. Temperatures climbed past 100 degrees by noon. The prisoners working outdoor jobs were given salt tablets and unlimited water, told to rest in shade during the worst of the midday heat. Another small mercy that Werner had stopped being surprised by, though it still struck him as remarkable. In Russia, soldiers had died of thirst within sight of contaminated streams they couldn't drink from. Here, clean water flowed freely, and the captors cared whether their prisoners got heat stroke. The work hardened Werner's body back to something approaching its pre-war condition. The regular meals, heavy on protein and vegetables, put muscle back on his frame. His ribs stopped showing, his face filled out. When he caught his reflection in the bunkhouse mirror, he sometimes didn't recognize himself. Not because he looked different, but because he looked alive again. His eyes had lost that 1,000-yard stare that marked men who'd seen too much death. Letters from home arrived sporadically, carried by the Red Cross through channels that were slowly being rebuilt across shattered Europe. The first letter from Ingrid came in late July, written in June, her handwriting shaky from hunger, or fear, or both. She was alive. Anna was alive. They were living in the basement of what had been their apartment building, sharing space with 6 other families. The city was rubble. Food was scarce. The occupation forces, British, in their sector provided minimal rations. She asked if he was being treated well, if he was safe, if he knew when he might come home. Werner read the letter 3 times, memorizing every word, trying to read between the lines for what she wasn't saying. She was hungry. She was scared. She was surviving, but barely. And here he sat 8,000 miles away, eating better than he'd eaten in his entire life, while his wife and daughter scraped by on charity rations. The guilt sat in his stomach like stones. That evening, he showed the letter to Joe. They'd fallen into a habit of talking after work, usually while sitting on the porch of the ranch house, drinking iced tea and watching the sunset. Joe didn't pry, but he listened when Werner needed to talk, and sometimes that was more valuable than advice. Joe read the letter slowly, his weathered face creasing with concentration. German was beyond him, but Werner had translated the key parts. When Joe handed it back, his expression was troubled. "She sounds like a strong woman," Joe said finally. "Takes strength to survive what Europe's been through." "She is strong. Stronger than me, maybe." Werner folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket. "But strength has limits. I eat 3 meals a day here. She eats 1 maybe. How do I live with that?" Joe was quiet for a long time, watching the sun paint the clouds orange and gold. "You can't change where you are, can't change what happened. All you can do is what's in front of you. Work hard, save your pay, send money home when you can, and maybe when you do get home, you'll have learned something here that you can take back with you." "What could I possibly learn here that would help in Germany?" Joe turned to look at him directly. "How to build instead of destroy. How to grow things instead of taking them. How to be strong without being cruel." He paused. "Your country's going to need men who understand that. Men who've seen both sides. Men who know that there's another way." Werner thought about that as the sun slipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared. He thought about it through dinner, through the evening routine back at camp, through the quiet hours before sleep. Joe was right in a way. Germany would need to rebuild, would need to learn from its mistakes. But Werner wasn't sure he was the man to teach those lessons. He was just a soldier, a tank commander who'd followed orders and survived when so many hadn't. But maybe that was enough. Maybe survival itself was a kind of victory. September brought a change in temperature, a subtle cooling that the Texans called autumn, but that still felt like summer to Werner's German sensibilities. It also brought news that sent ripples of excitement and anxiety through the camp. Japan had surrendered. The war was truly over now. All of it, every front, every battle. The killing had finally stopped. For the prisoners, this raised the question. Nobody wanted to ask out loud, what happens to us now? Would they be sent home immediately? Would they be held for years as the Soviets were rumored to be doing with their German prisoners? Would they be put on trial for war crimes, every soldier judged for the actions of the regime they'd served? The uncertainty gnawed at Werner. He wanted to see Ingrid, and Anna wanted to hold his daughter, who was now 7 years old and had spent half her life without a father. But he also dreaded returning to the rubble of Hamburg, to a defeated nation occupied by foreign armies, to a future that looked impossibly bleak. And if he was honest with himself, truly honest, he would miss this. The work, the horse, the feeling of building something instead of destroying it, the simple dignity of being treated like a man instead of a prisoner or a keg in a war machine. One evening in late September, Joe asked Werner to stay after work. The other prisoners had already loaded into the truck, but Joe waved them on, saying he'd drive Werner back to camp later. Werner felt a flutter of nervousness. In 3 months of working together, Joe had never asked him to stay behind alone. They walked to the main corral, where a young stallion barely 2 years old was being kept separate from the other horses. The animal was beautiful, a dark bay with a white star on his forehead, all nervous energy and untested potential. I bought him last month from a breeder in Oklahoma, Joe said, leaning on the fence. Good bloodlines. He'll make a fine stud if he can be trained properly. But he's green as grass and stubborn as a mule. Nobody's been able to get close to him without getting kicked. Werner watched the horse circle the corral, muscles rippling under his coat ears, constantly moving, alert to every sound and movement. You want me to work with him? I want to offer you a job. Joe turned to face Werner directly. A real job, not prisoner labor. When you get released, whenever that is, I want you to stay on here as my horse trainer. Room and board included, plus $60 a month to start. That's good money for ranch work, more than most hands make. Werner stared at him, unable to process what he was hearing. You want me to stay in America? If you want to, law says prisoners of war can apply to stay if they've got employment and a sponsor. I'd sponsor you. Eventually you could bring your family over. It takes time, paperwork, but it can be done. I've already talked to a lawyer about it. The offer hung in the air between them, massive and impossible and terrifying. Werner's mind raced. Stay in America. Bring Ingrid and Anna here. Start over in a country that had been his enemy, that had killed his comrades, that had destroyed his homeland. But also a country that had running water and electricity and food enough to feed its prisoners better than most armies fed their soldiers. A country where a rancher who'd lost his son to German bullets could still look at a German soldier and see a man worth employing. A country where the future existed as something other than rubble and starvation. I don't know what to say, Werner managed. Don't say anything yet. Think about it. Talk to your wife when you write. It's a big decision. But the offer stands whenever you're ready to answer. Joe clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that had become familiar, almost fatherly. Then he walked toward the house, leaving Werner alone with the nervous stallion and a choice that would define the rest of his life. That night, Werner wrote the longest letter he'd ever written. He told Ingrid everything. About the ranch, about Joe's offer, about the possibility of a life in America. He tried to be honest about what it would mean. Leaving Germany forever. Learning a new language, new customs. Becoming foreigners in a foreign land. But also safety. Food. A future for Anna that didn't involve rubble and occupation and rationing. A chance to build something instead of just surviving. I won't make this decision alone, he wrote. This is our family, our life. If you say no, I will come home and we will rebuild in Hamburg together. If you say yes, I will work to bring you here, however long it takes. Tell me what you want, my love. Tell me what you think is best for Anna. I trust your judgment more than my own. The letter went out with the next Red Cross shipment. The answer, if it came at all, would take weeks or months. In the meantime, Werner had work to do. He began working with the young stallion the next day. Approached the corral slowly, hands visible, voice low and steady. The horse watched him with white-rimmed eyes, ready to bolt or kick. Werner didn't try to touch him, just stood at the fence, talking quietly, letting the animal get used to his presence. Day after day, Werner came to the corral. Day after day, he moved a little closer. He brought treats, carrots, and apples from Mary's kitchen. He let the stallion smell him, learn that he meant no harm. It was slow work, frustrating work that required patience. Werner hadn't known he possessed until the war beat it into him in the form of long waits between battles. But gradually over weeks, the horse's fear diminished. He began to approach Werner instead of fleeing, began to accept touch first on his neck, then his face, then his flanks. Werner could see Joe watching from a distance, could see the approval in the old rancher's eyes. "You've got a gift for this," Joe said one evening, as they watched the stallion trot around the corral, finally calm, finally trusting. Natural horsemen, it's rare. Most people think it's about dominance, about showing the horse who's boss. But you understand it's about partnership, about earning respect instead of demanding it. Werner thought about that word, partnership. It was how America had won the war, wasn't it? Not through dominance alone, though they'd had the military might, but through partnership with Britain, with Russia, with occupied peoples who'd seen liberation as preferable to Nazi rule, through building alliances instead of just conquering territories. Germany had tried to rule through force, through fear, through the belief that might made right. And they'd lost to a country that understood the value of willing cooperation over forced submission. Everything was a lesson if you paid attention. October brought cooler weather and Werner's answer from Ingrid. The letter was longer than usual, written over several days based on the different inks and handwriting that varied from neat to shaky. She'd thought about his question, had prayed about it, had asked Anna what she thought, though at 7 the girl didn't fully understand what was being asked. Ingrid had talked to neighbors, to family friends, to anyone who might offer perspective, and her answer was yes. "Come home first," she wrote. "Come see us, hold us, be with us. But then if the offer still stands, if you still think it's right, then yes, take us to America. I don't want Anna to grow up in ruins. I don't want her to remember hunger the way I will remember it for the rest of my life. I want her to have what you describe safety food, a future. And I want you to have work that makes you whole instead of work that destroys you." She continued, "The neighbors think I'm mad. They say we should stay to rebuild Germany, that running away is cowardice. But I don't care what they think. I care about keeping our family alive and together. And if that means leaving everything we've known, then so be it. We've already lost everything that mattered except each other. Geography is just geography." Werner read the letter with tears streaming down his face, not bothering to hide them from his bunkmates. Hans, who'd received his own letter from home that week, struck you all and understood. Otto, practical as always, just nodded and said, "Good woman you've got there. Don't lose her." Even Friedrich, who'd grown quieter over the months, didn't make his usual accusations of betrayal. The fight had gone out of him, beaten down by the daily evidence that America was exactly what it appeared to be, strong, prosperous, and fundamentally uninterested in revenge. Werner went to Joe the next day and accepted the offer. They shook hands on it, and Joe promised to start the paperwork immediately. It would take time, he warned. Immigration was complicated, especially for former enemies. But he had connections, lawyers who specialized in this sort of thing. It could be done. The official notice came in November. Prisoners would begin being repatriated in January, sent back to Germany in groups based on various factors. Werner's group was scheduled for late February 1946. He would go home, see his family, and then begin the process of returning to America legally. The final months at Camp Swift took on a bittersweet quality. Werner knew he was leaving, that these Texas sunsets and ranch mornings and honest days of work had an expiration date. He tried to memorize it all to store up memories against the cold German winter he'd soon face. Joe threw a small party for him in December, the week before Christmas. Just the ranch hands and a few neighbors, nothing fancy. But there was a turkey that Mary had roasted, potatoes and gravy and pies, and everyone treated Werner not as a prisoner, but as a friend who was leaving. One of the neighbors, an old man who'd ranched in Texas since before the First World War, pulled Werner aside and said, "You're all right for a German. Come back when you can." Texas could use more men willing to work hard. It was perhaps the highest compliment a Texan could give. On Christmas Eve, Joe gave Werner a gift. A leather wallet, simple but well-made, with Werner's initials tooled into the corner. Inside was $200 in American currency. "I can't accept this," Werner protested. "It's too much." It's your wages plus a bonus. You earned every penny, and you're going to need money when you get home. Germany's in bad shape. This might help at least a little. Werner tried to argue, but Joe was immovable. Finally, Werner accepted it, overwhelmed by the generosity of a man who owed him nothing and had already given him so much. That night, alone in his bunk, Werner counted the money. $200. At current black market rates, assuming the Reichsmark had any value at all, this was more money than he'd ever possessed at one time. Money that could feed his family for months. Money that could bribe officials or buy passage or make the difference between survival and starvation. He thought about writing to Ingrid, telling her about the money, but decided to surprise her instead. He'd bring it home, put it in her hands, show her that he'd been working, that he hadn't been idle while she suffered. January 1946 arrived with cold rain that turned the Texas plains muddy and gray. Werner's work at the ranch slowed as winter set in. The horses needed less training, more feeding. The work became routine maintenance, mending fence damaged by storms, repairing buildings, preparing for spring. His departure date was set February 20th. He would travel by truck to Houston, by ship to New York, by another ship to Hamburg. 4 weeks of travel if everything went smoothly. By late March, he'd be home. The thought filled him with equal parts joy and dread. On his last day at the ranch, Joe walked him around the property one final time. They checked on the horses, inspected the repairs Werner had made to the barn, looked over the fields that would be planted with hay come spring. "That stallion you train," Joe said, stopping at the corral. "I'm calling him Werner. Seems fitting. He wouldn't be what he is without you." Werner looked at the horse, now calm and steady, responding to Joe's commands with the trust that had taken months to build. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. You come back, you hear. You get your family settled. You do what you need to do, but you come back. This job will be waiting." They shook hands one last time, and Werner climbed into the truck that would take him back to Camp Swift for the last time. As they drove away, he turned to watch the ranch recede into the distance, the white house and red barn and endless sky, all of it already becoming memory. The day of departure was chaos. 200 German prisoners, sorted by destination, loaded into trucks and driven to Houston. The camp that had been home for 8 months emptied out, leaving behind only the buildings and the memories of men who'd learned that their enemies were more complicated than propaganda had suggested. Hans was in Werner's group, heading back to Munich. Otto was going to Berlin. Friedrich had been sent home a month earlier, still bitter, still certain that Germany had been betrayed rather than defeated. They'd said their goodbyes without warmth. The ship that carried them back across the Atlantic was military transport, basic but adequate. The food was still better than what awaited them in Germany. The prisoners were quiet, contemplative. Each man lost in thoughts about what they'd left behind and what they were returning to. Werner spent his days on deck when the weather allowed, watching the ocean roll past gray and endless. He thought about Joe's words, "Take what you learned here and bring it home." But what had he learned exactly? That Americans weren't monsters, that abundance changed everything, that there were different ways to be strong, or maybe the lesson was simpler, that people were people, regardless of which flag they fought under, that kindness was possible even between enemies, that the future didn't have to repeat the past. The ship docked in Hamburg on March 18, 1946. Werner stood at the rail, looking at the city he had left 6 years earlier. What he saw made his heart sink. The Hamburg he remembered was gone. In its place was a landscape of rubble and ruins. Whole neighborhoods had been reduced to broken bricks and twisted metal. The docks were barely functional. The buildings that still stood were pocked with bullet holes and shrapnel scars. Smoke rose from makeshift shelters. People moved through the streets like ghosts, thin and gray and defeated. This was home. This was what he'd fought for. This was what remained. The prisoners were processed through a British checkpoint, given papers that identified them as released POWs, and told they were free to go. Free. The word felt hollow in a city that looked like the end of the world. Werner navigated the ruined streets, asking directions from people who looked at him with dull eyes, following half-remembered paths to where his apartment building had been. Had been. Past tense. The building was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble with a few walls still standing like broken teeth. But someone had painted an address on one of the remaining walls, the forwarding address for survivors. Werner followed it through 3 more destroyed blocks to a basement shelter that had been converted into makeshift housing. And there, in a dimly lit room that smelled of mold and too many people living too close together, he found them. Ingrid was 31, but looked 50. She'd lost weight, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow. But when she saw him, those eyes filled with life and tears, and she ran to him, threw her arms around him, held him like she'd never let go. Anna hung back shy, not recognizing this stranger who was supposedly her father. She was 7, small for her age, her blonde hair cut short and uneven. She looked scared and fragile and heartbreakingly beautiful. Werner knelt down, put himself at her level. "Hello, Anna. I'm your papa. I've come home." She studied him gravely, then looked at her mother for confirmation. Ingrid nodded, crying openly now. Anna took one hesitant step forward, then another. Then she was in his arms, small and warm and real. They held each other in that basement room, a family reunited in the ruins of a defeated nation, and Werner cried for everything lost and everything found and everything still to come. That night, after Anna was asleep on a mattress stuffed with newspaper, Werner gave Ingrid the wallet with the $200. Her hands shook as she counted it. She looked at him with wonder and disbelief. "Where did you get this much money?" "I worked at a ranch in Texas. The owner paid me wages." Werner took her hands in his. "And he wants to keep paying me. Wants us to come to America, all 3 of us. If you still want to. If you still think it's right." Ingrid looked around the basement room at the mold on the walls and the single candle providing light and the sound of other families arguing through thin petitions. Then she looked at their daughter sleeping peacefully for the first time in months because her father was home and she felt safe. "Yes," Ingrid said. "Yes, we go to America. We go as soon as we can." It would take time, paperwork and approvals and immigration quotas. Joe's lawyer had warned it might take a year, maybe 2, but they would wait. They would survive here in the ruins, living on Werner's American dollars in the hope of something better. And in the meantime, Werner would tell his story to anyone who would listen, would describe the ranch and the running water and the casual abundance of a country that had won not through cruelty, but through having more of everything than anyone else, would try to plant seeds of understanding in the rubble of hatred. Some people called him a traitor. Some called him a fool. But others listened, especially the young ones who'd survived the war and wanted to build something different. They listened when Werner talked about earning trust instead of demanding it, about partnership instead of dominance, about the strength that came from creation rather than conquest. Slowly, Germany began to rebuild. And Werner waited for his papers, worked odd jobs, saved money, and dreamed of Texas sunsets and the patient work of training horses. He thought about the steak that had made him cry, about the meal that had changed everything. Not because it was special, but because it was ordinary. Because in America, abundance was ordinary. And that more than any weapon or tactic or ideology was why they'd won. The letter came in November 1947. Visas approved, passage arranged. The Richter family would sail for New York in January, arrive in Texas by February. Joe had found them a small house on the ranch property. The job was still waiting. Werner held the letter with shaking hands, read it to Ingrid and Anna, and finally allowed himself to believe it was real. They were going home, not to the home they'd lost, but to a new home, a home they'd chosen, a home where Anna could grow up with enough to eat and running water, and a future that looked like possibility instead of ash. On a cold January morning in 1948, Werner Richter stood at the rail of a ship leaving Hamburg for the last time. Ingrid held Anna's hand. Together, they watched Germany recede into the distance, becoming memory, becoming past. Ahead lay America. Ahead lay Texas and a ranch and honest work and a man named Joe who taught Werner that enemies could become friends if you gave them a chance. Ahead lay the future. And for the first time since 1938, Werner believed the future might be worth living.